My name is Nick Allgood, and I am one quarter of the Team 33 for History 318, Fall 2019 A Session. During the early 19th century, farming was the main profession of most Americans. 90% of Americans were farmers during this time frame after the British Revolutionary War. Due to America's westward expansion, canals were sought after as a means to move crops to more profitable markets. Most families were responsible to make items, machines to make life easier. This is the first form of engineering in America. French and British styles of engineering influenced the American engineering styles. French-style engineering is based on the needs of the military and the national government. French engineers were lower nobility and highly educated. The focus is on why something works instead of how it works. British style of engineering is the exact opposite of French style. British engineering is based on production of goods. British focus more on hands-on learning and trial and error. British engineers were mainly lower-class people and not educated. Their focus is on how something worked and not why it worked. The Erie Canal began in 1816 and was headed by 3 judges and 1 school teacher to plan the canal. None of these people had any experience in canal building. Many things were based on trial and error methods of British engineering. The canal expanded over 300 miles in New York and was built by manpower instead of heavy equipment that we use today. Completion of the canal was in 1825 when DeWitt Clinton poured water from Lake Erie into the New York harbor, called the Marriage of Waters.
Hello, my name is Michael Bachkalupi. The rise of professional societies in the United States correlates to the rise of big business. As industry required more skilled and educated engineers, they began to define the roles they should play in society and how they should define themselves. Engineers asked, should we be in a position to advise or just follow orders? What makes up a professional society? A combination of specialized knowledge, formal membership criteria, an ethical code, and autonomy. Engineers set out to increase social status for themselves. This, of course, would lead to increased compensation, advancement of professional aims, and to provide independence. We discussed 4 different societies, starting with ASCE and AIME. Very different approaches to the questions. ASCE was interested in a design and skill-based criteria and a separation from business, agents of the court. AIME was all about improving the business of mining and membership to anyone who was in mining. The other 2 discussions were ASME and AIEE, both middle ground societies that opened both the membership and ties to business, but neither in as dramatic a sense as the AIME. They also had a moral code of ethics, not as strict as ASCE. Education changes in the United States began to change in the early 1800s. Previously, the United States higher education focused on law, medicine, and clergy, an expensive opportunity for only about 1% of the population. As the Erie Canal and West Point began to create the new field of American engineers, more schools began to appear. The largest change to the availability of education was the Morrill Land Grant Act of 1862. In this, land was granted to each senator to be sold by the state to use the funds to build schools for the development of agricultural and mechanical arts. Early on, this was slow as there was a huge amount of land, some 30,000 acres per senator, limited teachers to teach, and an underprepared student body. As the country started to expand participation in high school, the colleges were able to further educate incoming students. Land grant eventually became a big success from just 21 schools to
Hi, my name is Julia Bullock, and I will be speaking about the relationship between engineers and business, the social status of engineers as employees, professionals, and students, as well as the exclusion of women and minorities in the 19th century. At the beginning stages of engineering, there weren't many engineers, but during the 1880s and 1920s, industries were booming, and thus there was a large demand for engineers. During this time, engineers in company hierarchies were seen as regular employees and not in leadership roles. So the response to this was to create professional societies in order to raise the social status of engineers. These societies had different balances between engineers as professionals and as part of business. 2 polar opposite examples were the ASCE and the AIME. While ASCE was leading more towards professionalism, AIME was leading more towards business. Then after these societies had their differences, a mixture of business and professionalism societies came up to create a balance. The point of these societies were to raise the social status of engineers to be better recognized as professionals in the business industries. Social status of engineering was raised by engineers themselves with these professional societies and also With the Morrill Land Grant Act universities, engineering degrees became a norm for engineers to enter the industry as professionals. While the social status of engineering was being raised, engineering had been mostly white male dominant, and women and minorities were often excluded and not given credit for their intelligence or ideas. Women were often deemed too weak or not smart enough for technical work. They were also given no access to apprenticeships or educational opportunities. African Americans in engineering had similar difficulties. Slaves that had technical skills were often not considered engineers because they had no independence, and freed blacks had to face discrimination. Although they had access to education, their education was inferior because of these separate but equal programs.
Hello everybody, my name is Jordan and I'll be summarizing the period between the years of 1870 and 1920. And during this period we saw different patterns of invention. We saw that every new invention became a system itself. These systems consisted of a producer, an object, and a social context. In my example here you can see Thomas Edison as the producer, a light bulb is his object, and the social context is New York where he implemented this light bulb. During these years, we also saw radical and conservative inventions. Radical inventions such as the biplane by the Wright brothers, which completely revolutionized the transportation industry, and more conservative inventions such as this new telegraph button patent that we see here. Lastly, we questioned the linear model, which starts with research and ends with a product or a new invention. But now it was not always the case during these years. This was a time of trial and error and a lot of experimentation. During this era, we also had independent inventors, which had a lot of commonalities. In this case, we see they all have their own labs. However, there was two categories to independent inventors. We had professional and non-professional inventors. Our professional inventors got most of their money from big magnates such as J.P. Morgan here in my example. And non-professional inventors like the Wright brothers had to fund their projects with their own money. Lastly, we saw industrial labs or laboratories. Here we see Alexander Graham Bell and Bell Labs, which have huge headquarters, different outposts, research labs, and most importantly, they have a ton of personnel, very qualified personnel, and equipment. This is it for my portion. This is the end. Thank you for watching, and if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to comment.